Okay, Cyril, you're up.
Well, welcome everyone. I see that we have quite a number of participants to our authors webinar today, and welcome to the Victoria Island Jewish Community Center, Vancouver, Victoria Jewish Community Center. Today, I'm happy to introduce Jonathan Dunsky. Jonathan is an Israeli. He's a husband, he's a father, he's an IDF veteran, he's an entrepreneur, he's a lecturer, and he also happens to be an author. He has quite a number of books, mostly mystery books, novellas, short stories. He's quite prolific. His books have been recommended by the Jewish Book Council, and he's been very well reviewed in Goodreads and many other places. Today, he's going to be talking about 10 Years Gone. Before we turn it over to Jonathan, I just want to point out either at the bottom of your screen, if you're using a computer, or at the top on an iPad, there's a Q&A box. If you want to ask any questions, please type your questions into the Q&A, and Jonathan will be monitoring those, and we'll either answer them during the course of his presentation or for a few minutes at the end. We're going for an hour. We're a little bit flexible on that, but not too flexible. So enjoy this discussion of 10 Years Gone by its author, Jonathan Dunsky. It's all yours, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Cyril, and thank you everyone for attending this talk. Before I begin talking about 10 Years Gone and the Adam Lapid series in general, I'd like to say a few words about myself. As you already know, my name is Jonathan and I live in Israel. And over the past 6 years, I've written and published 8 crime novels, including 7 in the Adam Lapid series, which are historical mysteries that take place primarily in the early days of the State of Israel. And before I actually talk about the books themselves, I'd like to share something that may surprise you and that surprises all of my readers, is that despite working in English and writing in English, I am not a native English speaker. I've never lived in an English-speaking country, nor did I grow up in a home in which English was spoken regularly. And the only reason why today I'm able to write well-received books in English is because of a decision that I made when I was 13 or 14 years old. For some unknown, mysterious reason, I decided that I wanted to learn English thoroughly. I wanted to master this language. And so on one summer holiday, I picked up a book from my sister's shelf, and I remember it distinctly. It was The Stand by Stephen King, 1,141 pages of very dense text. And I read that book with a dictionary beside me. And each time I encountered an unfamiliar word, which happened quite often in those days, I would check it in the dictionary. And I continued doing this for several years until in high school, I was basically a dictionary myself. And I still do this to this day. But because I haven't lived in an English-speaking country, I'm not a native English speaker, I very rarely get the chance to actually speak the language, even though I work with it in writing and reading every day. So during this talk, I apologize in advance for whatever small mistakes that I'm likely to make, either mixing my idioms or stuff like that. Now, as a teenager, I wanted to be a writer. I admired writers like Stephen King and others that I read, and I got the notion that I wanted to write books myself. And I made a few juvenile attempts at the time, but none of them turned out pretty good. And by the time I enlisted into the Israeli Defense Forces and later entered into the workforce, that teenage dream sort of fell by the wayside. And I only returned to writing, only resurrected that dream in my late 30s when I stumbled upon the existence of the Kindle. And I learned that there were people who were writing books and publishing them themselves. And some of them were actually making a good living doing so. And it seemed to me that this fits my character completely. I wanted to be able to write whatever stories that I felt like writing, and controlling the entire process of publishing the book, deciding on the cover, the editor, and actually whatever I was going to write and how I was going to promote it. So I sort of immersed myself into reading again much more than I used to, and tried to sort of absorb the way stories were written and crafted and structured. And at the time I was living in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. So I found a writers group made almost completely by American expats. And fortunately for me, they accepted me as a member without asking me to submit any writing sample. Because if they had asked me, I don't think they would have accepted me as a member, because I was that bad. The first story that I submitted to them, apart from being lousy in terms of plot and characters and everything about it, I also submitted it just as a block of text. I did not even space out the lines or indent the paragraphs. I was that clueless about the way to format and the way to write, which goes to show that if some of you have this dream of writing and you don't feel that you're good enough at the moment, this doesn't mean that you won't be good enough in a year or in a couple of years if you decide to pursue it seriously. And from that group, I think I'm the only guy or the only member of that group who has published more than a single novel. So things can change in that way. But when I first started writing in my late 30s, I did not set out to write historical mysteries or write about Israel at all. I first tried to write science fiction and horror and fantasy, and I was getting nowhere. And this continued until one of the other members in the writers group told me that, you know a lot about Israel and you love Israel, so why don't you try to write a novel or a story set in Israel? And I took that advice to heart. And shortly thereafter, I just got the idea out of nowhere that became 10 Years Gone. And the idea was this. In 1939 in Berlin, in Nazi Germany, a young Jewish mother gives her baby boy away to a friend who is leaving Germany to mandatory Palestine, to the land of Israel. This young Jewish mother is unable to go with her baby because her husband has been arrested by the Germans, and she wants to stay in Germany and hopefully wait until they release him and then leave together. But she wants to save her child, to make sure that he's secure, so she gives him to that friend who is emigrating from Germany. Now, the mother gets stuck in Europe because of the Second World War and is only able to make it to arrive in Israel 10 years later in 1949. And in the 10 years in between, she has had absolutely no word from her son or from the woman to whom she entrusted him. And when she arrives in Israel, she seeks them out, but she's unable to find any trace of them. And so she goes to a private detective, Adam Lapid, to find her son for her, find out what happened to him. And when I first came up with this premise, I thought it would be a good premise for a mystery novel because it is an emotional premise, because losing one's child or having a child that's missing is one of the worst things that can happen to a person. And the entire setting of the Second World War, this woman arriving as a refugee to Israel, I thought it would be interesting and also a challenge to write a mystery for a detective to find out what happened to a missing boy, of which there is no trace for 10 long years. So once I had this idea in mind, I needed to build my main character, Adam Lapid. And I built him very much in the mold of hard-boiled detectives from the 1940s and 50s, from detective novels of that time and from film noir. So sort of the Sam Spade sort of time period, the Humphrey Bogarts and Raymond Chandler and people like that. So I wanted to have a private detective who's a loner, who is tenacious, who is rough around the edges, who's not just, pure of heart, but also has a dark side. And I wanted him to be a person who has to overcome trauma. And because of the time period, I decided to make him a Jewish Hungarian Holocaust survivor who lost his entire family in Auschwitz. He himself survived Auschwitz. And I thought that these experiences, what he went through and his loss, would influence his outlook on life, his outlook on justice, and also the way he is willing to dispense justice, because he saw the way in which civilization itself can crumble and turn into barbarism, and he cannot be unaffected by that. And I named him Adam Lapid for a few reasons. First of all, I chose the first name Adam because I wanted a name that sounds similar in Hebrew and in English. So Adam in Hebrew is Adam, which is pretty much the same, I think. And the name Lapid I chose because there was an Israeli politician called Yosef Lapid, or Tommy Lapid, that was his nickname. And he was a Hungarian Holocaust survivor. And he basically chose the name Lapid when he immigrated to Israel. And the word Lapid in Hebrew means torch. And I thought this had a certain symbolism that fits the mystery genre, because what does a detective do? He brings light into darkness. He uncovers secrets and discovers solutions to mysteries that are buried, and he sort of has to basically do the same work that a torch does. I wanted to give my detective police experience or investigative experience to be able to justify his ability to solve mysteries. So I decided that Adam Lapid, his backstory would be that he was a police detective in the police force in Hungary before the war, and then he was kicked out of the police force in Hungary in the late 30s once Hungary began to enact anti-Jewish laws, which basically removed Jews from various professions, and because Hungary sort of followed in the footsteps of Nazi Germany, and in the early stage, and throughout most of the war, was actually allied with Nazi Germany. I wanted to make Adam Lapid a man of action. So I also said that after he was liberated in the end of the Second World War, he was a Nazi hunter. So he took revenge on at least some of the people who were responsible for the loss of his family and so many others. And I wanted him to be an Israeli patriot, a Zionist, and a man of bravery. So I also gave him a background as a soldier in the Israeli Defense Forces during the War of Independence of 1948-1949, in which he suffered a near fatal injury and during a heroic battle. So at that point, I had a flawed character, a man who is haunted by his past, his loss. He has survivor's guilt, and he is very much a man which you would want in your corner, even though he doesn't always follow the rules. He can resort to vigilantism. He has learned that the law doesn't always provide justice as one might wish. And the overall series of books, as I discovered as I wrote them, and as I said, there are now 7 novels and 1 short story, is basically the story of Adam Lapid rebuilding his life in Israel, and putting his past behind him and learning to deal with what he's lost and becoming a whole person again. And the way I learn more about Adam Lapid is different from the way other writers create their own characters. I did not create a character sheet in which I wrote, about a detailed backstory about Adam Lapid. I basically discover him as I go along with each new book. Whenever I need to know something about Adam's past, his family, where he was born, stuff like that, I just make it up on the spot. And so I learn about Adam Lapid just as the readers of the books learn about him, just as we go along, just like we would learn about a person that we meet and slowly get to know better and better. Now, at this point, I had the idea for 10 Years Gone, the story about the woman who has given her child to a friend emigrating from Germany to the land of Israel, and the child has disappeared. And I did not plan the book in advance. I just started writing it from that premise. And I got stuck pretty early on, around about chapter 4 or chapter 5. I just could not make this story work. I was not that experienced of a writer yet. But by that time, I was sort of enamored with the character of Adam Lapid and the setting of the fledgling state of Israel. So I decided it would be nice to make it a series instead of just one book. And I decided, just because I'm stuck with 10 Years Gone, I'll try to write the next book in the series. And later on, after I finished that, go back to 10 Years Gone and then hopefully be able to complete it. So I wrote a book called The Auschwitz Violinist, which is this book. And it's a story about Adam Lapid's investigation of an apparent suicide of a man he knew in Auschwitz, a man who played the violin in one of the camp orchestras in Auschwitz, which were made up of prisoners. So, and this book turned out pretty well, but it turned out a bit short. So when I returned to 10 Years Gone, I thought I'll try to make this book a bit longer. And the way I thought I'll do that is by writing 2 separate mysteries that Adam Lapid will investigate sort of parallel to each other. And at some point later in the book, they'll dovetail together or connect in some way, which I did not know as I was starting. So I started writing again the story of the missing baby. And the second mystery was a different story, an investigation of the murder of a young Arab woman who was found dead in Tel Aviv. And I started writing these 2 stories, together. But after a few chapters, it became apparent that I was only making progress in the second story. I was still stuck on the story of 10 Years Gone. I was not able to pursue it. I was only able to continue the story about the dead Arab woman. So again, I set 10 Years Gone aside and wrote a book called The Dead Sister. So, and this became book 2 of the series. The Auschwitz Violinist became book 3. And only once I finished these 2 books did I go back to 10 Years Gone and finally got it done. And so by that time, I had 3 books completed in the Adam Lapid series. And since then, I've written the books as they appear on Amazon or other retailers, one after the other. So if any one of you dabbles in writing or is trying to write a series, you don't have to write the books in order. There's nothing that compels you to write books the way a reader would read them. And even within a book, even writing a book itself, you don't have to write the chapters in order. This is just a tip. This is something that I do if I get stuck in a story, but I know what needs to happen afterward. I'll often jump ahead, write a scene or a chapter that I know, and then just sort of complete the middle. And this is something that can work quite well. Now, because these are historical mysteries set in the late 1940s and early 1950s in Israel, I need to do a lot of research to create a vivid and realistic and accurate setting. And my philosophy on this historical background is simple. I try to learn as much as I can, but I don't put everything that I know into the novels, because my main goal is to write an entertaining story that flows well, that has a good pace, and the historical details, the historical background should serve the story, enrich the setting, make the setting and background more immersive, but it should not overwhelm the readers. I'm not writing history books, I'm writing fiction novels, mystery novels, and they should and the story always comes first. And the way I research, I use a variety of sources. First of all, I talk to people. I talk to people who lived in Israel at the time, who grew up here, or who can tell me about how life was like. So for instance, both my parents grew up in Tel Aviv as children in the 1950s. So I consult them a lot about the layout of the city, what people wore, what people ate, what games children played, what they did in their spare time. And they tell me pretty fascinating stuff. For instance, Tel Aviv today is pretty dense urban area, but in the 1940s and 50s, there were orange groves in Tel Aviv. There were many more private houses. There were even there was a zoo in the middle of Tel Aviv, which no longer exists today, which had been moved since then. And for instance, recently I interviewed a 94-year-old woman who lived in Tel Aviv as a young woman, and she told me a lot about what life was like. She was also a member of a resistance group who fought against the British, and she told me about that period of time and the sort of activities that they did. So just by talking to people, I learned a lot about the way life was in Israel in its infancy. In addition, I read memoirs, and I also read newspapers of the time. There's a database of Jewish newspapers in Tel Aviv University in many languages from all over the world, and reading newspapers allows me to get pretty granular in the level of research and the details that I'm able to put in the books. For instance, I can know which movie played in which cinema on a given day. I can read the headlines and know what were the news that occupied people's mind, and sort of products that were advertised, the political situation, and so on and so forth. And I also study maps, because some of the street names in Tel Aviv have changed since the 1950s to this day, and even sometimes even the layout of the streets can be different. And I also study photographs just to be able to paint a more vivid picture for the reader. Now, the research not only serves as to enrich the story, but it also is a fertile ground for new ideas. So from reading about that time, I can come up with ideas for new books. So for instance, the book that I'm writing now, which is going to be book 8 in the Adam Lapid series, the core idea for that novel came from a murder that took place in the 1930s in Mandatory Palestine, which I just stumbled upon by accident. And even though the murder that I talk about in the book is not really all that similar, but just the basic idea came from that research, from learning about things that happened in Israel at the time. And I can say that the research has allowed many people to sort of experience this, what readers say, experience Israel in a new light, or even connect to the stories that their parents told them about when they used to live in Israel in those days. And I know that people have even come to Israel on trips and walked around the streets of Tel Aviv with the Adam Lapid books just to see the sights and sort of walk in his footsteps, which is sort of nice. Now, during my research, I learned a lot about the state of Israel that I did not learn in school or anywhere else. And I want to share some of that background with you, because I think it's both interesting, because I think a lot of people don't know it. So, as you well know, Israel was established in 1948, but it only won its War of Independence in 1949. And the war was horrendous. Over 6,000 Jews were killed in that war, and this amounted to about 1% of the Jewish population at the time. So you can, of course, picture the extent of the way that the war touched pretty much everyone who lived in Israel at the time. And at the end of the war, Israel signed armistice agreements with its Arab neighbors, and these armistice agreements basically set what's today erroneously is known as the 1967 borders, but they were never recognized borders. They were just provisional armistice lines, which at Arab insistence, because they didn't want to recognize the existence of Israel in any borders. Now, just to put it in perspective, I mean, apart from the death toll, during that war, Tel Aviv was bombed by Egyptian airplanes a number of times. Jerusalem was besieged, and the Jewish population of Jerusalem was on the brink of starvation. There were great shortages in food and water and medicine. And for a time, it seemed that the entire city would fall. At the end of the war, Israel was divided between the kingdom of Transjordan, as it was known at the time. Today it's known as Jordan, and Israel. And the city remained divided until the Six-Day War. And it did not resemble the city of Jerusalem as it is today. It was sort of the center of of commerce and culture was in Tel Aviv, but the government said in Jerusalem, which was a much smaller place than it is today. And I talked with people who lived there. They said it felt more like a village even than a city. But apart from that, there were villages in kibbutzim in Judea and Samaria and in the Gaza Strip that were abandoned, and basically no Jews remained living there. Once Israel was established, there began a great influx of Jews from all corners of the world. Jews arrived in large numbers from Europe. Many of these were Holocaust survivors who arrived with basically nothing. And Jews from Arab countries such as Yemen and Iraq, most of whom also came with very little, but they of course came with families because they did not go through the Holocaust. And many of the Jewish immigrants from Europe either arrived alone or with new families that they created after the war. But there was also aliyah, or immigration of Jews from countries that were not directly touched by war, for instance, from Turkey and other places. And these Jews came to Israel as a result of a national or a religious awakening, sort of a dream come true in which there's a Jewish country again and we should live there. But what this created is this massive influx of Jews is that the population doubled within about 3 years. And Israel was a very poor and undeveloped country. And because these immigrants arrived with very little, there was a great challenge how to feed everyone, how to clothe everyone, where to house them. There wasn't sufficient housing in Israel at the time. So the government had to enact or take very drastic steps in order to just keep people alive and healthy. So for instance, in order to house the immigrants, the government created immigrant camps that were sort of shanty towns called ma'abarot, in which they were basically made up of tents or shacks. There was no running water or very little running water, just in a central building or something like that. There was very little electricity, and people lived in those camps sometimes for years in very dire, precarious conditions. And I want to show you a few pictures of the ma'abarot. So for instance, here's one picture of a ma'abarot taken. All these pictures are from the government press office collection. And as you can see, in this picture, you can see that the light hanging from the pole is not an electric light. And you can see the road is not paved. The shacks are sort of just built into the mountainside in a way. And this is how people lived. The government created a jobs program, sort of manual labor, just to give people something to do and to give them a little bit of income. And this still affects Israeli society to this day, that people remember how they used to live in these immigrant camps, while other people, those who came before them, or those who had connections, or those who had family already in Israel, lived in more modern housing in Tel Aviv or in other cities, or in the kibbutzim. In addition, there was great poverty. As I said, there was a real danger or a real fear that Israel would not be able to feed all the population. So the government enacted a strict rationing regime in which most food items were strictly rationed. And we're talking about eggs, coffee, sugar, meat, cheese, rice, anything and everything. And sometimes it would be, each person would got a ration card and each person was allotted a certain amount of all these various food items. And you would go to a store, and the vendor would just tear out a piece of the ration strips and give you your allotted food. And when I interviewed people who lived there, and I asked them, so what did you eat? What did you have? They basically said, we had nothing. Even though this wasn't, of course, true, but that's the way they felt, that they had nothing. And if you walk the streets of Israel at the time, you could, on occasion, come across sites, for instance, like this. So as you can see, the people are standing here in the street, waiting in line. This is not Soviet Russia. This is Israel in the 1950s. They're waiting in line to get kerosene to either cook or heat their home. And similar lines could be seen, snaking out of grocery stores or any other marketplace. So this rationing regime birthed a vibrant and widespread black market, which is a common theme in the Adam Lapid novels because it was a common theme in Israeli life. The black market encompassed much of Israeli society at the time, both as sellers and vendors, and the government fought against this in a variety of ways. Of course, they created propaganda in order to get people to stop buying stuff from the black market, but they also hired special policemen and inspectors who would stop vehicles and search bags and go into businesses in order to find contraband and prosecute black market vendors. And I know from a story of a family member of mine, that just to give you a bit of an anecdote of that time, that she, as a child, and her family traveled on vacation to the north of Israel, and on the way back on the bus, her mother hid a chicken under her dress, because when the inspector would come on the bus to search the passengers, he would not search a small girl. And in this way, they smuggled the chicken back home. So people were very creative in the way that they got extra food and extra nourishment for their children and family. Now, in addition to all this, when you used to walk on the streets of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or any other city, at that time, you would hear a medley of languages. Most of the Jews who came to Israel did not speak Hebrew. I believe the only exception were the Jews of Yemen, most of whom did speak Hebrew. But you would walk around the streets and hear people speak in German and in Dutch and in Yiddish and in Polish and in Arabic and all these different countries. And one of the main goals of the Israeli government was to take all these disparate tribes of Jews that came from all over, that had different customs, and some of which had very tenuous connection with each other over the centuries of living in the diaspora, and to forge a new Israeli Jew, a Hebrew Jew from all these different people. And the way they did this was by using the Hebrew language as a sort of unifying force in order to get the people together. And one of the steps they took was even the suppression of Yiddish, which I think is a big tragedy. But for instance, there was a comedy duo, a well-known comedy duo at the time called Jigan and Schumacher, and they performed in Yiddish. They were well known even before the Second World War, and in Poland. And when they arrived in Israel and wanted to perform, the government prohibited them to perform in Yiddish, and there was a great outcry. So the government surrendered part way and said that you could perform in Yiddish, but at least a third of the act had to be in Hebrew. So Jigan and Schumacher hired a Hebrew singer to sing a few songs during their act, so the songs covered the third of the act in Hebrew, even though the audience came only to see Jigan and Schumacher perform in Yiddish. Now, I'd like to talk a bit about the way that I write compared to the way other writers write, and which is similar to the way that I recommend writing. So I write without planning in advance, hardly anything. I get the idea for the, let's say, opening chapter, opening scene, or the crime in question, or just the premise. For instance, the premise of 10 Years Gone is, as I said, that this boy went missing on his way from Germany to Israel. And then I just start writing. I don't recommend this all that much because it's a nerve-wracking way to write, and it's a slow way to write, because I never am totally confident in advance that I'll be able to actually complete the story that I'm working on. And on each novel that I write, I get to a certain point in which I get stuck, and then I say to my wife, I think this is going nowhere. All these words will end up going to the bin. And she reminds me that I say the same thing on each book and sort of manage to work through it. But if you wish to write and are able to outline a book in advance, that's the way I recommend doing so. I think it's a better way to write quickly, and just to know the story is fully formed in advance. But one advantage to the way that I write is that I am constantly surprised by the way the story is taking me, because I don't know where the story is going in advance. I am unable to provide obvious clues to how Adam Lapid will solve the mystery, or to who the culprit is. And because I get surprised, I believe that's the reason why the readers get surprised as well. So for instance, in 10 Years Gone, I had absolutely no idea what happened to that missing baby, whether he was alive or dead, who the villain or villains of the story were. I just started writing and let the story take me on a journey with it, and sort of discovered as I went along what the solution to the mystery was. And with each book that I write, I sort of get to a point about 75%, 80% of the way through, in which I sort of get a light bulb moment, and I say, okay, that mundane sentence or mundane detail in chapter 2, that's the clue, and this is the killer or the culprit or whatever, and this is how Adam Lapid will solve it. And then I let out a big breath of relief and just write very quickly to the end. Now, what I got from writing about Israel and writing the Adam Lapid series, 10 Years Gone, and the other books, is apart from actually just creating the books and the joy of creation, the pride I get in actually writing books that are well received, is that I learned more about Israel than I ever did in school. And I appreciate more the journey that the country has taken from the early days in which Israel was very poor and undeveloped and sort of had a precarious existence, to what it is today, in which it is a developed country with a well-known high-tech industry, a vibrant culture, and a country that has provided many inventions and improvements to the entire world. In addition, I learned more about my parents' childhood, more than I'm sort of more interested today than I ever was before I started writing. And I also got to know readers from all over the world, both Jews and non-Jews. And I even connected with distant family members who found my books, recognized my last name, and just wrote to me to inquire whether we were related. So I even expanded my family through writing about Adam Lapid in Israel. Now, at the moment, the Adam Lapid series stands at seven novels and one short story. All the novels, apart from one, take place in Israel. Book 6, The Auschwitz Detective, is a prequel that takes place in Auschwitz-Birkenau before Adam Lapid, while Adam Lapid was a prisoner there before he came to Israel. And it's a murder mystery that is set among the prisoner population of Auschwitz. All of the books are available in ebook, in various print formats, paperback, large print, and hardcover. And the first 3 books are also available in audiobooks, and I'm currently producing audiobooks for the rest of the series. As for the future, I'm currently writing book 8, as I said, which is set in Israel in 1952. And I plan to continue Adam's story in Israel and to sort of follow Israeli history throughout the 1950s and maybe beyond, we'll see. And in addition, I plan to write at least one more prequel set in Europe after the Second World War, in which Adam Lapid sort of recovers from his imprisonment in concentration camps, and before he comes to Israel. And apart from that, I hope that at one point an Israeli publisher will decide to pick up the Adam Lapid novels, to translate them into Hebrew and to publish them for an Israeli audience, because I think the books will turn out quite well, will do quite well in Israel. So I think that's about wraps it up. I think my story about 10 years gone and the Adam Lapid series. So if you have any questions, please write them now and I'll answer them as so there's a question, which unit did I serve with in the Army? I served in the Communication Corps. So I served 4 years. This was I got discharged. I was discharged a little over 20 years ago. Okay, so someone is saying that they also learned about Israel through reading my books. So great. It's an added benefit to learn about that. Thank you very much, Susan. Susan is saying that she will buy the books for Hanukkah presents, which I think is a pretty good idea and should be adopted worldwide. Was the chicken alive? I need to ask about that. I imagine that it wasn't. Otherwise, there was a chance that it would squawk and alert the inspector. Leah is saying that she's curious about the reaction of actual Holocaust survivors to the character of Adam Lapid. I don't recall ever receiving an email from actual Holocaust survivors, and I did not do any effort to seek them out, and to put the books into their hands. I will tell you that after I published The Auschwitz Detective, which many people say is a story in which the regular or the everyday life of prisoners in Auschwitz is told in a way that they haven't encountered in any other book. And I can talk about that if you like, if someone would like that, I will talk about that in more detail. But I got an email from a reader whose both his parents were in Auschwitz. And reading the book proved a very emotional and even heartrending experience for him, because he never considered everything that his parents went through in Auschwitz. Because in the book, I get very detailed into how Auschwitz felt to prisoners. We all know that they were hungry, that they were fearful, and that they were cold. But most of us, I believe, never thought about how the place actually smelled. And smell is the most evocative sense that we humans possess. And I did not think about it as well until I researched quite thoroughly daily life in Auschwitz in order to write The Auschwitz Detective and to do justice to the incredible bravery and resilience of the people who were there, who survived that hell. So he got very emotional because it's something that I actually felt a little bad about it, even though he said that he enjoyed the book, that he thought the book was terrific. Where are your parents' family originally from? So my maternal grandparents came from Poland, and they arrived in Israel in the 1930s separately. My grandfather and my grandmother, but my grandfather, this is something very tragic. He arrived with his brother, and they were so poor and it was so hard to make a living in Tel Aviv in the 1930s that they actually shared a bed, not just a room. And it was so difficult that the brother gave up and returned to Poland. And of course, there he was murdered by the Nazis. And I think the family of my grandfather was entirely murdered, and most of my grandmother's family was also killed. As for my paternal grandparents, they came from, I believe it was Lithuania, even though the borders of Eastern Europe changed drastically until the end of the Second World War. But they moved in the early 1900s to South Africa, and they arrived in Israel in 1949 with my father already as a child. In particular, how do they regard his acceptance of vigilante justice? I don't actually know, but there were people who the activity of what's known as the Avengers, groups of Jews who hunted Nazis after the war, is very well known in Israel, and I don't think anyone does not understand what they did. And in general, well, I don't actually know. Some people in the reviews say that they feel sort of ambivalent about Adam Lapid's, his acceptance of vigilantism, but he only does this when he needs to. He doesn't do it when he doesn't have to, or when there's another solution. For instance, if he can turn the culprit into the police, he'll do that. But if there's no way to do otherwise, he'll exact justice by himself. Someone is suggesting that I should sell my books at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles. It's a great idea, but I'm not sure they'll accept fiction books, but I'll need to check that. What is the state of Israeli publishing industry? I don't know what the state of Israeli publishing is. I can say that I approached basically all the Israeli publishers and told them about 10 Years Gone, and I mentioned that the books were recommended by the Jewish Book Council. 10 Years Gone in particular this year is one of 10 fiction novels recommended by the Jewish Book Council for book clubs. And you can find book club discussion questions at the end of each of the Adam Lapid novels. And I can talk about the books that I recommend for book clubs in a minute. But I don't know. No, most of them did not even reply to my emails suggesting that they should translate the books. I mean, 10 Years Gone has 1,900 reviews on Amazon at a 4.6 average, and I would think that should be enough to convince them that this is a worthwhile story. But some of them, one of them told me that they're not publishing mystery novels at this time, which I actually believe to be not true. But once every few months, I sort of go through the rounds and email them again. So my latest book, A Death in Jerusalem, was recently received a glowing review in the Jerusalem Post. So I hope that as more recommendations and reviews pour into about the series, that some Israeli publisher will reach the right decision and decide to publish the books and translate the books and publish them. Someone is asking me about a certain character in The Payback Girl and why she had to die. So The Payback Girl is my 8th novel. This is the only modern crime novel that I've written. This is not an Adam Lapid novel, so I didn't discuss it in this book, in this talk. And I won't mention the name of the character that died, because for anyone who wants to read this novel, I won't spoil it. So why she had to die, it's just something that happened in the flow of the story. But I share your sadness about her death, because she was a very lovable character. Someone is saying that they had a professor called Leon Lapidus. Well, good. I'm not sure. Well, if he came from, Lapid is not actually the name, a Hungarian name. It's a Hebrew-Hebrewized name that this politician took upon himself when he arrived in Israel. This actually raises another interesting fact about Israel, that when Israel was founded, David Ben-Gurion decided that anyone working for the Israeli government, or has a government job, has to change his name to a Hebrew version. So, for instance, the second prime minister of Israel was named Moshe Shertok, and he changed his name to Moshe Sharet. Shimon Peres, his original name was Persky, and there were other examples. Will the new prequel that you are going to write about Adam would be about going after and killing the Nazis who terrorized him in Auschwitz? Probably, but I also have another idea, and I'll leave it at that because we'll see how that goes. Due to the method of writing, to what extent do you have to go back and correct inconsistencies in earlier chapters once you determine the solution? Well, I sort of cycle back and correct things and cycle back and correct things. And I need to do that. But once I finish the story, once the story is complete and I see that it's good, this isn't really all that much work. I need to correct certain things. I go over the timeline and see that everything is correct in the timeline and certain things that happen on a certain day. So for instance, that the shop is not open on the Sabbath and things like that. But usually there are not a lot of inconsistencies because I cycle back as I go along, as I figure the story out and just correct things as I go along. With my background in communications, would I please comment on how Israel seems to be losing the PR war and the latest tide in anti-Semitism, including what's going on in the UN? So my background in communications is not in actual person-to-person communications. I was in a computer unit, so I don't know anything special about persuasion and media and things like that. Israel will always lose at the UN at the moment because there are 57 Muslim countries and only one Jewish country. And of course, it's much easier to offend the Jewish country than it is to offend 57 Muslim countries. But I have no solution to that problem. But I will say that people who are concerned about Israel's standing in the international community today have very little idea about how bad it used to be in the 1940s and 50s. Israel at the time had very few or much fewer diplomatic relations with many countries. For instance, there were basically no relations with India. And India was, for instance, very hostile to Israel or very cold to Israel throughout much of its existence. And in recent years, there's been a great thawing of that relationship, and Israel and India ties are very close today. There were of course, no diplomatic ties or very little with China. With the Eastern Bloc, there were very tense relations with Russia and with many other countries all over the world. And Israel had to win them over through the things that she could give them in terms of technology and agricultural advancement and things like that. So the situation today is much better than it used to be. It's worse in Europe, and it's not as good as it was in the United States, let's say 20 years ago. But overall, the situation is not as dire as many people make it out. But as for the situation in American or in British universities, I have no solution to that problem. I think it's a big problem, but beyond the scope of my knowledge and of this talk. Someone is asking, did I make Adam's girlfriend a prostitute to show the roughness of his character? No, Adam has, just to explain to people who haven't read the books, Adam has a relationship with a certain prostitute in some of the books. But basically, what happened is that I needed him to go someplace in The Auschwitz Violinist, and I had no idea where he can go, so I just invented Sima Vaknin, the prostitute, on the spot, and she sort of became this character that sort of leapt out of the page, and so I kept her on for a few books. Someone is saying that my genre is more historical fiction, like Thomas Cahill. I've never heard of this person. I'll need to check out his books. But the person that some of the writers that people mention alongside myself, one of them is Philip Kerr, who also wrote historical mysteries. And some people, I believe, a lot of people like Daniel Silva because the books are set in Israel, even though the books are not similar at all. But many people also, but some people have also mentioned me in the same breath as such luminaries as mystery writers like Lawrence Block and even Raymond Chandler, as I said. And Lawrence Block, who is my favorite writer and a terrific mystery writer, actually read 10 Years Gone and provided a very glowing review of it just recently. Are there any other questions? Because there are none open at the moment. Okay, so someone is writing, Thomas Cahill wrote How the Irish Saved Civilization and the Gift of the Jews. So I'll have to check them out. Thank you, Vernon.
Well, with no more questions, I think I'm going to thank you, Jonathan. This was a very interesting, very instructive webinar. And we really appreciate the time that you've taken to prepare for this and to enlighten us on your writing process, as well as the characters that populate some of your books. It was very interesting and very interesting questions, and thank you for all of this.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. For those of you that are on our waiting list, watch to see our email list, watch to see when our next webinar is. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you all.